Picture this. The bells of St. Peter's Basilica echo across Rome, their sound meant to call the faithful to prayer. The square outside is filled with pilgrims kneeling, crossing themselves, whispering holy prayers. But behind the Vatican walls, in corridors heavy with the smell of wax and incense, something else is happening. A shadow moves, whispering not of salvation, but of sin. It is the late 15th century, and the man the world calls Holy Father sits on the papal throne. Yet his heart beats not for God, but for power, pleasure, and family ambition. The people see him lift the chalice, bless the crowds, and proclaim himself the shepherd of souls. But in the secret chambers of the Vatican, he is something else entirely. A man whose sins would make even the emperors of pagan Rome bow their heads in shame. This is the story of Rodrigo Borgia, who rose to become Pope Alexander VI, a story of divine robes masking worldly lust, of holy words hiding unholy acts, from Holy Father to sinner, from God's representative on earth to history's most infamous pope.
The tale begins far from Rome, in the dusty town of Játiva, near Valencia, Spain. On January 1st, 1431, Rodrigo de Borgia was born. Not in splendor, not in marble palaces, but in the modest streets of a provincial land. The boy had no idea yet that destiny would carry him to the throne of St. Peter. But bloodlines are powerful, and his uncle, Alfonso de Borgia, was already climbing the church's golden ladder. By 1455, Alfonso wore the triple crown himself, taking the name Pope Calixtus III. And with his rise, Rodrigo's path was sealed, like hot wax pressed onto a papal decree. Rodrigo entered Rome with ambition burning in his chest. At 25 years old, he became a cardinal deacon, not because of holiness or humility, but because of nepotism. His uncle placed him high in the church hierarchy, not out of merit, but out of family loyalty. The Vatican had always been a stage of politics, but with Rodrigo, the theater turned into something darker. In those years, Rome was a city of contradictions. By day, golden altars shone, pilgrims wept, priests chanted Latin hymns that rose like smoke toward heaven. But at night, those same streets were filled with vice. Brothels, gambling houses, and dark alleyways where knives flashed quicker than prayers. Rodrigo understood this world better than most. He did not walk the narrow road of piety, he ran the wide road of ambition. He collected church offices across Europe as if they were jewels to be hoarded. Every title brought more money, every land grant more influence. He was not living like a priest, but like a prince. His palaces overflowed with gold, with feasts, with women. And oh, the women! Rodrigo's lust was as well known as his hunger for power. His mistresses bore him children one after another, living proof of his double life. The most important of them was Venosa Catanei, a Roman noblewoman sharp in mind and striking in beauty. Between 1474 and 1482, she gave Rodrigo 4 children: Juan, Cesar, Lucrezia, and Joffre. 4 children who would not be hidden away in shame, but paraded openly, raised to play their parts in Rodrigo's ruthless game of power. Rome knew the truth. Even as a cardinal, Rodrigo's scandalous behavior shocked the city. And this was in a time when scandal itself was normal. Pope Pius II once wrote Rodrigo a letter condemning his outrageous conduct in Siena, his excesses so blatant that even the worldly Romans whispered. But Rodrigo did not care. Shame was a luxury he could not afford. He had set his eyes on the papal throne, and nothing would stop him. By the time the conclave of 1492 arrived, Rodrigo Borgia was ready. Inside the Sistine Chapel, 23 cardinals gathered beneath the painted ceiling to choose the next pope. Gold passed from hand to hand. Promises floated like incense. Church titles were handed out like loaves of bread. It was not a holy election. It was an auction. And on August 11, 1492, when the white smoke finally rose, Rodrigo Borgia emerged as Pope Alexander VI. His path from dust of Valencia to the throne of Peter was complete. But make no mistake, his rise was not the work of divine favor. It was the work of gold, of bribes, of simony, the buying and selling of holy offices. Rodrigo had played the Vatican like a gambler plays dice, and he had won. Rome exploded in celebration. Bonfires burned across the 7 hills, torchlight parades lit the night, and crowds cheered as if a savior had arrived. On August 26th, at his grand coronation in St. Peter's, the applause shook the marble walls. People thought God had placed the right man on the throne, but they would soon see the truth.
At first, Pope Alexander VI wore a mask. He knew the eyes of Christendom were upon him, and so he played the role of a reformer. Rome, at the time of his election, was a city drowning in blood. Murders were so common that more than 200 deaths had been recorded in just a few months. Streets were ruled by thieves, mercenaries, and gangs who cared little for the law of God or man. Alexander acted swiftly. He divided Rome into districts, appointed magistrates, and sent guards into the streets. For a moment, it seemed the Eternal City had found peace again. Pilgrims whispered that perhaps the new pope was God's answer to their prayers. He even opened the doors of the Vatican every Tuesday, listening to common people's complaints with his own ears. To many, it looked like a golden dawn was rising over Rome. But power, like wine, reveals the truth of a man's soul, and Alexander's soul was poisoned. The reform soon faded, like smoke blown from a candle. Behind the walls of the Vatican, he was not the humble shepherd of souls. He was the head of the Borgia family, and every praetor, every decree, every strategy now revolved around one obsession: raising his children to greatness. Juan Borgia, his eldest son, was made Duke of Gandia and married into Spanish royalty. His second son, Cesar, only 18, was given the powerful archbishopric of Valencia. Soon after, he became a cardinal. These appointments were not acts of faith, but of dynasty building. Positions that should have gone to holy men were handed to teenagers, treated like stepping stones in a family empire. And then there was Lucrezia, Rodrigo's beloved daughter, beautiful, intelligent, and destined to become a pawn in the chess game of papal politics. Her marriages would be arranged and broken like bargains at a marketplace, her life traded away for alliances that served her father's power. The papal palace, during Alexander's reign, did not feel like the house of God. It felt like the court of a Renaissance prince: lavish banquets, music, and feasts that lasted deep into the night. Cardinals, who should have been preaching penance, sat at tables groaning with roasted meats and rare wines. Foreign ambassadors joined the merriment, their silence purchased with gifts of gold and land. And walking boldly through the Vatican halls was Giulia Farnese, Rodrigo's mistress. Known as Giulia la Bella, her beauty was legendary across Rome. She was young, radiant, and shamelessly present in papal ceremonies. Her open place beside the Pope mocked the vows of celibacy he had sworn, a public reminder that Alexander did not even bother to hide his sins. For some, this was shocking. For others, it was exciting. For all, it was proof that the Holy Father was now little more than a worldly prince, wrapped in sacred robes. But Alexander's mistresses drew whispers. It was his master of ceremonies who gave us the clearest picture of these years. Johann Burckhardt, a German cleric with sharp eyes and a sharper memory, served as the Vatican's official recorder. His diary, the Liber Notarum, became a window into everything the Pope did: grand ceremonies and disgraceful scandals alike. Burckhardt was no dreamer. He wrote without passion, without exaggeration, like an accountant recording numbers. And yet, in his pages, we see the dual life of Alexander VI. One day, a solemn mass at St. Peter's, incense rising to heaven. The next, a feast so decadent that the air smelled not of holiness, but of wine and sweat. Alexander VI promised order. Instead, he delivered corruption: systematic, deliberate, and shameless. The Vatican became a stage where the sacred and the sinful were performed side by side, the line between them vanishing with each passing year.
If Alexander VI was the head of the church, his children were its hidden rulers. Each one became a weapon in his hand. His eldest son, Juan Borgia, was the golden child. Handsome, confident, and spoiled beyond measure, Juan was showered with titles and wealth. Alexander made him Duke of Gandia, married him into Spanish royalty, and paraded him as the future of the Borgia dynasty. But Rome whispered. They said Juan was arrogant, cruel, and unworthy of the honors he carried. His soldiers despised his arrogance, and noble families mocked his incompetence. Still, Alexander blinded himself to the truth. To him, Juan was perfection. Then came Caesar Borgia, brilliant, ambitious, and ruthless. Unlike Juan, Caesar was not satisfied with the church. Though he had been forced into holy robes as archbishop and later as cardinal, his heart was not in prayers or sacraments. His true gift was war. He was clever in strategy, fearless in battle, and cold in calculation. Where Juan was pampered, Caesar was sharpened like a blade. Their sister, Lucrezia Borgia, was a different story. History remembers her as a pawn, married off again and again to seal alliances her father needed. But she was more than that. Behind her soft smile and gentle voice, Lucrezia carried the same intelligence and cunning as her father and brothers. Her beauty was matched only by her political usefulness. One marriage to strengthen ties with Milan, another with Naples, and whispers of darker rumors followed her wherever she went. But even the strongest dynasties rot from within. On June 14, 1497, Juan Borgia's body was pulled from the dark waters of the Tiber River. His throat had been cut. His body carried 9 stab wounds. Rome froze in shock. Who could dare to kill the Pope's beloved son? The answer, whispered in every alley, was chilling. His own brother, Caesar. No proof was ever shown, no trial was ever held, but everyone in Rome knew Caesar's ambition left no room for Juan. Juan was weak, Caesar was strong. Only one could inherit their father's empire, and Caesar was not willing to wait. The murder broke Alexander VI. For 3 days, the Pope shut himself in his chambers. He refused food, refused Mass, and wept like a father stripped of his heart. Rome had never seen him so undone. For a brief moment, people thought grief might change him, that the Pope who had been so shameless in his sins might turn to God at last. And for a short while it seemed true. Alexander announced reforms. He spoke of limiting the luxury of the papal court, of ending corruption and returning to holiness. Cardinals drafted new rules. Even skeptics began to hope. But just as quickly as it came, the change faded. The grief of a father gave way to the ambition of a pope. Juan was gone, but Caesar remained. And now freed from the robes of a cardinal, Caesar embraced the role he had always desired, that of a warrior prince. Alexander turned all his power, all his wealth, all his schemes toward building a kingdom for Caesar. The papacy itself became a weapon to carve out an empire in Italy. Church offices were sold like merchandise, indulgences like currency, and the gold of salvation poured into Caesar's wars. The Borgias were no longer just a family. They were a storm, raging across Italy, feared by nobles, envied by kings, and hated by the church that had given them their throne. By the autumn of 1501, the Borgias had reached the height of their power. Caesar had carved out a dominion in central Italy, winning battles and inspiring both admiration and terror. Alexander had filled the papal treasury with gold from indulgences and bribes. Rome was theirs, body and soul. And then came the night that would haunt history forever. The night of the Banquet of Chestnuts. It was October 31st, All Hallows' Eve.
the night when the veil between sacred and profane was said to be thinnest. The choice of date was either coincidence or a cruel joke played on God himself. Inside Cesare Borgia's Vatican chambers, the walls glowed with candlelight. Frescoes of saints and Roman gods painted by Pinturicchio looked down from the ceiling, silent witnesses to the spectacle below. Guests arrived, cardinals draped in crimson robes, Roman nobles, ambassadors from foreign courts. They came not for prayers, but for something darker. The evening began with a feast. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, exotic fruits, and goblets filled with the richest wine. Laughter filled the air, the kind of laughter that grows louder as inhibitions fade. And then the real entertainment began. 50 courtesans, dressed in silk and velvet, entered the hall. At first they danced slowly to music played by hidden musicians. Their movements were elegant, almost innocent. But as the wine flowed, silk fell to the floor one piece at a time, until the dance became something no prayer could redeem. Johann Burkhard, the papal master of ceremonies, stood in the corner, recording it all in his diary. His words were cold, clinical, yet the images they described would stain the Vatican's name forever. When the tables were cleared, servants placed the candelabras on the floor. Chestnuts were scattered across the marble tiles. The courtesans were ordered to crawl on hands and knees, chasing the nuts under the flickering light. The marble floor echoed with laughter, the rustle of flesh, and the cruel amusement of men who should have been shepherds of souls. And there, in the seat of honor, sat Pope Alexander VI. By his side, Cesare, the host of the evening, and with them, Lucrezia, whose presence has puzzled historians for centuries. Was she a willing participant in her family's shame, or simply a prisoner of her father's will? No one can say. But all sources agree she was there, watching the night descend into darkness. The climax of the evening was a contest. The male guests were challenged to prove their virility with the courtesans, prizes promised for those who could perform the most. Servants kept count like scorekeepers at a tournament, while Alexander himself looked on. Fine clothes, shoes, and jewels were handed to the victors. Sin wrapped in silk. The Vatican's holy chambers had become a theater of lust. The Pope had become its spectator. Rumors of that night spread quickly. Diplomats carried stories back to their homelands, letters filled with horror and disbelief. Preachers thundered from pulpits that the church was rotten to its very core. Even in Rome, where scandal was common, the banquet was too much. It confirmed every suspicion, every whisper, that the papacy had become not a shepherd of Christ, but a carnival of corruption. For Alexander VI, the banquet of chestnuts marked the point of no return. Whatever dignity remained in the papal office was burned away that night, replaced with shame that history would never forget.
On the night of August 18, 1503, the Borgias' luck finally broke. Alexander VI, the man who had once ruled Rome with gold and scandal, fell suddenly ill. The official story claimed malaria, but whispers spread through the streets that he had been poisoned, perhaps by his own cup, perhaps by a rival's. The truth was never certain. What everyone knew was this: the most powerful pope in living memory was dying. The Vatican fell into chaos. The courtiers, who had once feasted in his halls, suddenly turned silent. The cardinals, who had cheered at his banquets, now whispered about his sins. Alexander's body, swollen and discolored, was laid out for burial. Few mourned him. To Rome, it seemed less like a tragedy and more like a judgment. Cesare Borgia, the son Alexander had gambled everything for, found himself without his father's shield. His enemies closed in like wolves. His armies crumbled, his power slipped through his fingers, and within 4 years, he was dead, killed as a mercenary in Spain. Lucrezia, the daughter whose name had been dragged through every rumor of poison and incest, managed to escape her family's shadow. She married Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, and transformed herself into a respected duchess. In Ferrara, she built a court of poets, artists, and musicians. Where once she was seen as a pawn in her father's games, she ended her life admired for her intelligence and grace. But history is not kind to the Borgias. For centuries, their name became a symbol of corruption. Preachers thundered about them as examples of sin. Writers and painters turned them into living allegories of greed and lust. Even today, when we hear the name Borgia, we don't think of prayers or saints. We think of poison, scandal, and betrayal. And at the center of it all stands Alexander VI. He began as Rodrigo de Borgia, a young Spaniard chasing opportunity. He rose as a pope who brought order to Rome's bloody streets. But he fell as the man who turned the papacy into a stage for scandal. His reign showed the world the dangerous truth. When holy power and human ambition mix, the result can be both magnificent and monstrous. The frescoed rooms where the banquet of chestnuts took place are still in the Vatican today. Tourists walk past them, staring at Renaissance art without knowing the secrets once hidden in those walls. The candles have long burned out. The courtesans, the cardinals, the Borgias themselves have all turned to dust. But the memory remains. A pope who called himself the Holy Father, and a sinner whose fall shook the Catholic Church forever.